What if the next major sci-fi collectible boom isn't hiding in Star Wars, Marvel, or the usual blockbuster franchises, but in a series of comics tied to one of the most influential science fiction stories ever written? Over the past few years, the world of Dune has exploded back into the cultural spotlight. New films have brought massive audiences into the universe, television projects are expanding the lore, and younger fans are discovering the story for the first time. Whenever a franchise grows this quickly, collectors start asking an important question. Which early collectibles connected to that universe could become valuable? One possibility that's gaining quiet attention is Dune comics. Today we're exploring whether Dune comics could become the next big sci-fi investment category. Unlike superhero comics that have decades of collector infrastructure behind them, Dune comics exist in a more unusual position. They connect to a legendary science fiction story, but they haven't yet reached the same collector recognition as other franchises. To understand whether they might rise in value, we need to look at several key factors: the strength of the Dune franchise itself, the scarcity of early Dune comics, the role of media adaptations in collectible markets, the psychology of collector discovery, and the long-term storytelling power of the Dune universe. The first key point is franchise strength. One of the most important drivers of collectible value is the cultural power of the story behind the item. Dune is widely considered one of the greatest science fiction novels ever written. Since its publication in 1965, the story has influenced generations of writers, filmmakers, and game designers. The novel introduced readers to a complex universe built around politics, ecology, religion, and interstellar conflict. What makes Dune unique among science fiction properties is the depth of its world building. Franchises with this kind of narrative depth tend to endure across decades. We've seen similar patterns with other science fiction universes, such as Star Wars and Star Trek. Each time those franchises expanded through new films or shows, collectors returned to the earliest comics and books tied to the universe. Dune is currently experiencing a similar expansion cycle. New cinematic adaptations have brought the story to global audiences, creating a surge of interest in everything connected to the franchise. When a story reaches that level of cultural visibility, collectors often begin searching for early artifacts connected to it. The second key point is scarcity and availability. Dune comics occupy an unusual space in the collectible market. Unlike many superhero comics that were printed in enormous numbers, some Dune-related comic series had relatively modest print runs. The Marvel adaptation, released in the 1980s, is a good example. At the time, it was produced as a licensed adaptation tied to the film version of the story. Because the movie received mixed reception during its original release, the comic never received the same attention as other major Marvel titles of that era. This limited attention has an interesting side effect today. Many collectors simply overlook the comic for decades. As a result, relatively few people preserved high-quality copies compared with more popular superhero books. Even if the original print run was not extremely small, the number of surviving copies in excellent condition may be lower than expected. This is a pattern we often see with comics tied to films that only later become cult classics. Another aspect of scarcity involves grading and condition. Modern collectors pay close attention to high-grade copies certified by grading services. When a comic becomes desirable, collectors often compete intensely for the best preserved examples. If relatively few high-grade copies exist, prices can increase rapidly as demand grows. The third key point involves media adaptation cycles. Media exposure has become one of the most powerful forces in the comic market during the past 2 decades. When a character or story appears in a major film or streaming series, collectors frequently rush to acquire the earliest comics connected to that property. This pattern has repeated many times across the comic market. Characters introduced in relatively obscure issues suddenly become highly sought after once they appear on screen. Dune is currently in the middle of a major adaptation wave. The recent films introduced the universe to millions of viewers who had never read the original novel. Television projects set in the same universe are also expanding the story. Each new adaptation acts as a form of marketing for the entire franchise. As fans search for more ways to explore the world of Arrakis, they often discover comics that previously received little attention. This effect does not guarantee that Dune comics will become extremely valuable. However, it does create the conditions where collector interest can grow. When fans discover older media tied to a franchise, early print materials often gain new relevance. The fourth key point is collector discovery. One of the most interesting patterns in collectible markets is how overlooked items can suddenly gain attention. Many collectibles remain undervalued simply because collectors focus on more famous items within the same franchise. Over time, however, collectors begin searching for new pieces of the history behind a story they love. When this discovery process begins, collectors often explore the earliest versions of a franchise's visual storytelling. For Dune, that includes the comic adaptations that attempted to translate the complex world of the novel into illustrated form. As more collectors realize that these comics represent an early attempt to visualize the Dune universe, interest can increase. Another factor in collector discovery is the idea of completion. Fans who collect Dune memorabilia may want to assemble a comprehensive set of items tied to the franchise. That includes novels, film posters, action figures, and comics. As more collectors pursue complete Dune collections, the comics naturally become part of the conversation. The fifth key point is long-term narrative power. Stories that remain culturally relevant for decades often support strong collectible markets. Dune has demonstrated an unusual level of staying power. Even before the recent films, the novel continued attracting new readers each generation. Themes such as environmental responsibility, political intrigue, and human evolution remain relevant today. This long-term narrative relevance helps keep the franchise alive. As long as the story continues inspiring new adaptations and interpretations, interest in early materials connected to it is likely to continue as well. Comics linked to the Dune universe benefit from this broader cultural momentum. However, it is important to recognize that not every collectible tied to a major franchise becomes extremely valuable. Some items remain niche pieces appreciated mainly by dedicated fans. The future of Dune comics will depend on several variables, including how the franchise evolves, how many collectors enter the market, and how scarce high-quality copies ultimately prove to be. Another factor to consider is the broader growth of science fiction collecting. Over the past decade, interest in science fiction memorabilia has expanded significantly. Collectors increasingly look beyond traditional superhero comics to explore other genres. This shift creates opportunities for properties like Dune that have strong literary and cinematic foundations, but relatively underdeveloped comic markets. It is also worth noting that comic collecting has become more global. Online marketplaces and grading services have made it easier for collectors around the world to participate in the hobby. As international audiences discover the Dune franchise, demand for related collectibles could grow beyond traditional markets. Even so, the possibility that Dune comics could gain stronger collector recognition remains intriguing. They combine several characteristics that often precede collectible growth: connection to a major franchise, limited attention in earlier decades, and increasing cultural relevance due to modern adaptations. For collectors interested in science fiction history, Dune comics also represent something more than financial speculation. They capture a moment when artists attempted to translate one of the most complex science fiction worlds ever created into the visual language of comics. That creative effort alone gives them historical significance within the broader story of science fiction media. In the end, whether Dune comics become the next big sci-fi investment will depend on how the franchise continues evolving and how collectors respond to that evolution. If the Dune universe continues expanding through films, television, and games, early comics tied to the franchise may gain new attention. For collectors, the most interesting opportunities often appear before the wider market notices them. Exploring overlooked corners of major franchises can reveal fascinating pieces of storytelling history. Dune comics may represent one of those overlooked corners waiting to be rediscovered. If you enjoy exploring the world of sci-fi collectibles and the stories behind them, consider subscribing for more discussions about comics, books, and media that could shape the future of collecting. Let me know in the comments whether you think Dune comics have the potential to become major collectibles, or if other sci-fi properties might rise first. Sometimes, the most exciting discoveries in collecting begin with a simple question about a story that refuses to fade away.